Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Stargate SG-1. In this video, I give my full-on, detailed review of the entire 10 seasons run of Stargate SG-1, so I'm going to have to give a spoiler warning for all of Stargate SG-1. If you haven't seen the entire series, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. So, I wouldn't call Stargate SG-1 one of my favorite shows of all time. As far as science fiction shows go, I tend to prefer the first 3 Star Trek spin-offs, but it is definitely a fun, quality series and one of the best shows the Sci-Fi Channel has ever had. Stargate SG-1 is based off the 1994 movie Stargate, and to be perfectly honest, I didn't think too highly of that movie. I remember when I first saw it, I really wanted to like that movie, but when I look at it honestly, there isn't that much to it. It's not that good of a movie. However, the idea it presented of a portal capable of instantly transporting people to other planets was a fascinating idea, and it sounds like a great idea for a TV show rather than a singular movie, especially if said device is capable of going to multiple locations. So as it is now, Stargate SG-1 has had 10 seasons, 2 spin-off shows. That it's become, whenever I think of Stargate, I don't think of the mediocre film, I think of the great TV show franchise, and in particular the star show that started it all, Stargate SG-1. So the pilot episode of SG-1 serves as a sequel to the Stargate movie and takes off where the film left off and reintroduces us to Colonel O'Neill and Daniel Jackson. However, Colonel O'Neill, who in the film was played by Kurt Russell, is now played by MacGyver's Richard Dean Anderson. And these two characters are absolutely nothing alike. In the film, he was a tough, no-feeling military jarhead, and in the show, he's a slick-talking, sarcastic leader. Not that I'm complaining. They made this change, as I much prefer the show's version of Colonel O'Neill. In fact, I think it's fair to say he made the show, and it was only as good as it was because of him. But it's clearly not the same character. They should have just introduced a new character for Richard Dean Anderson to play. It would have made a lot more sense, but whatever. However, that's not the only thing the show changed from the movie, as in the film, the Stargate clearly only went to one world, and it was about one specific alien who impersonated the Egyptian god of Ra and abducted a bunch of humans and took them to that world as slaves. However, the show changed it from being a singular alien to a whole race of aliens known as the Goa'uld, who are worm-like parasites that inhabit human hosts and who have conquered planets across the galaxy. In fact, it was later learned the entire galaxy is filled with planets inhabited by humans who are descendants from those on Earth who were taken by the Goa'uld through the Stargate to many other worlds. And overall, the Goa'uld rule the galaxy, posing as gods. None of this mythology was in the movie, and it was all made up for the show, as was the concept of Jaffa. While in the film, Ra did have some human minions, they were never specifically named. In the show, they are introduced as Jaffa, a race that carries the baby Goa'uld symbionts as incubators in their stomachs, which gives them superior strength and healing power. And they, of course, worship the Goa'uld as gods. So the show makes one of these Jaffa who rebels against the Goa'uld as one of the main characters. Hence you have Teal'c. The premise also gives us Samantha Carter, another military officer, but one who's more of a science genius, and thus you have the main cast of Stargate SG-1. So, Stargate SG-1 followed the team of these 4 as they traveled to different worlds throughout the galaxy and encountered many different cultures and aliens and strange sci-fi circumstances, while time to time dealing with their main adversary, the Goa'uld. And I'll be perfectly honest, at times it can come off as a bit of a rip-off of Star Trek Next Generation, as from time to time the plots of the episode and the circumstances they come across are remarkably similar to the ones that the Star Trek spin-offs have. But that being said, it does give its own unique spin to it by setting it in a contemporary setting with members of the Air Force as our heroes, and it has much more lighthearted, as well as the lead character, Colonel Jack O'Neill, only becomes more and more of a sarcastic joker as the series goes on. As does the whole team. They end up having a very childlike, playful banter relationship throughout the series. So let me get into some of the characters. First, there's Jack O'Neill, whom, as I said, pretty much made the show. Has his antics and sarcastic attitude made the show worth watching, as well as being a realistic, believable character that you could relate to, which is very important to have on a show with a lot of over-the-top sci-fi. Then there's Daniel Jackson, the geeky archaeologist who, over the course of the 10 seasons, slowly turns into a big, muscular military archaeologist. But overall, he does have a sort of playful attitude and is often the brains of the operation who looks at things from an intellectual perspective. But then you have the technobabble brains of the operation, Samantha Carter, who is unrealistically smart and can set up any strange, complicated sci-fi device you can think of in an instant. Other than that, she does come off as a kind of down-to-earth character as well, someone you can really root for. Then there's Teal'c, who is really the Worf-like character, as he is from an alien warrior race who is very stoic and says "indeed" all the time, who's obviously meant to represent the alien sci-fi aspect of the show. We also get a bunch of supporting characters over the years, such as General Hammond, the military officer in charge of the Stargate program, who does a good job of coming off as a father figure and one of wisdom that has a good relationship with Colonel O'Neill and SG-1. I always found him a good addition to the cast. And Dr. Fraiser, whom I'm sorry, but reminds me a lot of Dr. Crusher, but has more of a sassiness to her. And in the 6th season, when Daniel Jackson left the show for a year, we got Jonas Quinn, played by Parker Lewis Can't Lose, if you remember that show. He's very similar to Daniel Jackson as being geeky in the book type, but also has the storyline of trying to fit in and be one of the team. I thought he worked fine as a temporary replacement. And by season 9, Jack O'Neill and General Hammond has left the show, so we get an almost entirely new cast with Colonel Mitchell and General Landry, as they are interesting enough characters. Colonel Mitchell reminds me a lot of the character that the same actor played on Farscape, except he talks about his grandmother a lot. He was okay. He's no O'Neill, but he was entertaining enough, I suppose. And General Landry, it's hard for me to not just simply think of him as Beau Bridges. He just comes off as a typical general, very similar to Hammond. And to be honest, I didn't really think that much of him. I mean, he was okay, I guess. But it feels like we never really got to know him. And then in season 10, the reoccurring character of Vala Maldoran became a main cast member. Like Colonel Mitchell, she was played by a Farscape actor. However, her character was completely different than the one she played on Farscape. And to be honest, I never liked this character, as she was way too over-the-top silly, and she came off as really annoying often enough. There was also a barrage of reoccurring characters like Jacob Carter, Samantha's father, who was taken over by a friendly Goa'uld known as the Tok'ra, where they exist in a symbiotic state similar to the Trill from Deep Space Nine. He was cool. And Braytak, the seasoned Jaffa, who was Teal'c's mentor, and I thought he worked well in that mentor role. And some human pain in the asses, such as Senator Kinsey, played wonderfully by Ronnie Cox, who I thought did an amazing job playing an asshole senator. I really liked the use of this character. He was someone I loved to hate. And also Colonel Mayborn, who starts off as a colonel, but then later in the series, after SG-1 arrests him, he turns into a shady fugitive. He was okay as a villain, I guess. I didn't mind him, but didn't think he was that great either. So now let me get into the long-term story arcs of the show by examining the main adversaries. I first started watching this show after it had finished airing, and I remember the first thing I thought after watching the first season was, how in the hell are they going to keep this up for 10 seasons? It seems like the story had pretty much run its course by the end of season 1, which was about Daniel's wife getting abducted by Teal'c's former master, the evil Goa'uld Apophis, that wishes to take over after Ra's demise. And he is hell-bent on attacking Earth, which he does at the end of the season 1 finale, but fails in the season 2 premiere, obviously. But he remains a threat throughout season 2 until dying at the hands of his adversary, Sokar. But then, consequently, comes back to life in season 3 and kills Sokar to take over all of his territory and power. So I suppose that brief time that he was presumed dead, Sokar was the main villain, but we never actually see him until the 2-part episode in which he is killed off. So never really thought that much of him. He starts to become, Apophis starts to become the most powerful Goa'uld and plans to overthrow the System Lords, who currently have a treaty with Earth, which of course, he would not respect. And to be honest, I never thought very highly of Apophis. Just seemed like another generic evil guy. Not much to him. But I liked the season 3 storyline of Daniel Jackson searching for his now deceased wife's son, who has the power to defeat all of the Goa'uld, and I like the conclusion to this in season 4, even though it was kind of a cop-out, because they just learned the knowledge was too much and would destroy them if they, used it, and it would just corrupt them, because absolute power corrupts absolutely, and I liked the way this was pulled off. Anyway, in the first 2 seasons, we meet an alien race of powerful aliens known as the Asgard, who take on the persona of Norse gods such as Thor, who become friends with SG-1. And if of Thor you're thinking of the comic book character, his big muscular white guy, that's actually just a disguise. And the Asgard do in fact look like the stereotypical Roswell aliens. Anyway, the Asgard are so powerful they can easily defeat the Goa'uld, so obviously the writers had to make up an excuse as to why they simply didn't just do that. So they came up with a secondary bad guy who was kicking the Asgard's asses in their own galaxy that SG-1 would have to contend with from time to time, known as the Replicators, a race of cybernetic bugs that eat everything in sight and, well, replicate. And I'm just going to come right out and say it, the Replicators were just a ripoff of the Borg. And it's obvious to me they were just trying to make the Replicators every bit as scary and awesome as the Borg, and in my humble little opinion, they failed miserably. I never really thought that highly of the Replicators. I didn't completely hate them, but I didn't think that much of them either. So during the 4th season, we would get the occasional Replicator and storyline and the occasional Apophis storyline. But honestly, I was totally sick of Apophis at this point and thought he sucked. So in season 5 premiere, thankfully they had the Replicators kill Apophis off. So for a while we were without a big bad guy, but then started hinting at being a mysterious Goa'uld going around kicking everyone else's asses, and it was later revealed that Goa'uld is Anubis. But before I get into Anubis, let me talk about the Ancients. As you see, during SG-1's travels, they discovered the Goa'uld did not build the Stargate system. They nearly used them after the race that built them were no longer around. And the race that built them is known as the Ancients, who are apparently the first evolutions of humans on Earth. Which might also explain where all the human populations come from that are spread out throughout the entire galaxy, but not why they all speak English. Anyway, the Ancients apparently ascended to a higher level of existence to become beings of pure energy, and that's like a real Buddhist type vibe to this ascension of, meditating and all of that. Now, the Ancients are first mentioned in Season 2, but aren't really explored in any depth until Season 5 or later, and would go on to become the main basis of the last few seasons of Stargate SG-1, and the basis for both spin-offs, Atlantis and Universe. At any rate, they are important to mention because at the end of Season 5, Daniel Jackson, while near death, is met by an ascended ancient who helps him to ascend to the higher level of existence. This ancient is known as Tasala, whom we first met in Season 3, but to be honest, they completely changed her character and were not at all consistent with what they established, because originally she helped people ascend and she interfered with humans and the Goa'uld all day long. But then the writers came up with the same problem that they did with the Asgard, that these ascended beings were too powerful and could defeat the villains far too easily. So this time the excuse that they devised was to have the ascended ancients have a rule where they are not allowed to interfere with the physical beings at all, but Tasala was kind of rogue and lived on the edge of these rules. Anyway, getting back to Anubis, we later learn that he is an ascended Goa'uld sent back to the physical realm, which explains why he was gone for thousands of years and why he has technology and power far superior to that of the other Goa'uld. And with that power, he soon brings the System Lords to their knees and becomes an unstoppable enemy hell-bent on destroying Earth. Anubis is kind of a cliched evil guy who wears a cape, has a deep evil voice, and talks like this: "I'm Anubis, I'm going to kill you," and is kind of just a massive energy wrapped up in a cloak. He has like a Darth Vader vibe to me, and personally, I think he's the best villain SG-1 has ever had, and one of the best on television. Even though he comes off as kind of cliched, they played him just right by spending a lot of time setting him up and keeping a lot of mystery surrounding him, but more than that, making him the unstoppable enemy who was truly menacing, like the Borg. Basically what they failed to do with the replicators. So during Season 6, he's a dark presence in the background, but barely appears. Instead, we get the introduction of the humanoid replicators as they evolved beyond being simply bugs and can talk now. But they're still not scary, and SG-1 seemingly traps them in a time dilation device where they are frozen in time. Also, in the 6th season is where the show starts getting a bit outrageous, where we're introduced to the US military having giant spaceships built by stolen Goa'uld technology, as well as smaller Star Wars X-Wing type ships called X-302s. So in Season 7, Daniel Jackson returns, and the Anubis situation becomes more desperate as he comes close to wiping out all life on Earth several times, and Daniel Jackson advises that the only way to stop Anubis is by finding the lost city of the ancients that should have a weapon to defeat him. So after a huge epic battle where Anubis tries to destroy Earth in what is my opinion my favorite episode of all of SG-1, the Season 7 finale, The Lost City, they find the weapon capable of destroying Anubis, and they wipe out his entire fleet once and for all and save Earth. But still, they haven't quite found the Lost City, which actually leads to the spin-off show Stargate Atlantis. So the Lost City storyline is completely dropped from SG-1 and is continued on the spin-off show. In Season 8, a Goa'uld that has appeared in several episodes previously, named Baal, takes over all of Anubis's power and becomes the new bad guy. Now, Baal was never really that big of a baddie in the way that Apophis or Anubis were, but I thought he fit the role that they gave them quite well. It was more of a cheeky adversary than an out-and-out villain, and I thought it was that he fit that role quite well. Now, Baal was actually first introduced in Season 6, but he became more prominent in Season 8. So I actually quite like this character. However, Season 8 also saw the introduction of a new replicator baddie as a particular humanoid replicator named 5, who has a crush on Samantha Carter, killed all the other humanoid replicators, and took over as the king of the replicators. And then he abducted Samantha Carter, and once she escaped, he crafted a replicator version of Samantha Carter called Replicator Samantha Carter. So Replicator Samantha Carter eventually kills Five and takes over as being the new queen of the replicators, and she is set on taking over our galaxy. So then a huge battle ensues where the replicators begin wiping out the Goa'uld, which seems like good news. No Goa'uld, except that they would be replaced by a even more menacing adversary, the replicators. So conveniently enough, SG-1 discovers a Deus Ex Machina ancient device that allows them to wipe out the replicators. However, we learned that Anubis is still alive and was just using Baal, and he plans to use the same device to that they used to wipe out the replicators to wipe out all life in the galaxy. But thankfully, Daniel Jackson convinces the ascended being Umazasala to sacrifice herself in order to stop Anubis once and for all. So, Season 9 begins, and it's almost like an entirely new show. As I mentioned earlier, this is when Colonel O'Neill and General Hammond are gone and replaced by Colonel Mitchell and General Landry, as well as the addition of Vala to the team. And with that, we get a whole new adversary, as apparently the Goa'uld are all but defeated now, taken over by the Jaffa Rebellion, and only Baal remains, who isn't that big of a threat. So instead, we meet the Ori. The Ori Priors. The Ori are an offshoot of the ancient ascended beings that used their minions known as Priors to enslave an entire galaxy under a religion that where they are the gods, and they sap the power from their followers to make them more powerful, while promising that once they die they will ascend as well, which is in fact complete and total bullshit. They have no intention of helping them to ascend. So they have much more powerful ships than anything that we've ever seen, and they begin an invasion of our galaxy, where they convert every world to their religion, and anyone who refuses to convert to the religion are destroyed. So it's very reminiscent of villains from the Chronicles of Riddick or the Star Trek New Frontier novels. In fact, I think it's fair to say a version of these villains have been done a dozen times before. That being said, as a lifelong atheist myself, I always appreciate commentary that bashes religious fundamentalism, and sometimes their analogies to modern day times were a tad bit obvious, such as portraying the Priors as not staying true to the spirit of their religion and just using it to acquire power and incite hate. So overall, I didn't hate the storyline, but I didn't think it was the best thing either. At any rate, by this stage they switched themes, where it was no longer had an Egyptian mythology theme, but more of a King Arthur theme and the Knights of the Round Table, as apparently Merlin was an ascended being that created a weapon capable of destroying the Ori, which they used to kill the Ori, but their pesky followers remain, wreaking havoc. In addition, Season 10 saw the introduction to a new villain, the Orosai, who the Ori impregnated Vala with in order to slip past the Ancients, a humanoid who was part Ori, who was played by Firefly's can't quite pronounce her name, but she played Inara on that show. Anyway, I thought she was an effective enough villain, not as cool as Anubis, but more interesting than Apophis. So Baal remained and became a sort of, villain who would become a pain in the ass from time to time. In fact, eventually he tries to implant a symbiont clone of himself into the Orosai, as an attempt to take over the Ori fleet, but when that fails, the Orosai ascends and then takes the place of the Ori, who are all dead. So the storyline is then concluded in the TV film The Ark of Truth, where SG-1 used a very convenient Deus Ex Machina ancient device that allows them to make all the Ori followers see the truth, and thus the Orosai loses all of her power and they defeat them once and for all. Then in the other TV movie Continuum, after a failed attempt to alter the timeline, Baal is defeated and executed, and thus the main villains are now all defeated. My conclusion from all this is that the writers of Stargate seem incapable of telling long-term story arcs without creating a powerful, unstoppable foe who controls the galaxy and is bent on destroying Earth. And, they even do the same thing for Stargate Atlantis with the Wraith, which I'll get more into when I review that show. Suffice to say, sometimes it worked, other times it didn't, but overall it gets a bit old. And just goes to show that the writers always fall back on the same plot devices far too often. That is until Stargate Universe, but I'll get more into that when I review that show. Also, you may have noticed from that little summary a repeated motif of SG-1 needing to find an ancient device, a Deus Ex Machina device that instantly kills their unstoppable enemy. I think they did that too many times as well. So since the main protagonists of SG-1 were the U.S. military, this series can appear to glorify the military, and they never portray them in a negative light, which is understandable considering they relied on them, their support for supplies, equipment, and advice, so they don't want to piss them off too much. That being said, the show never comes off as flag-waving propaganda like some other military-based shows tend to, and although they never portrayed the military in a negative light, they often point out the faults of the U.S. government and how the structure isn't perfect. We even get a storyline with rogue government agents that try to steal alien technology and wreak a lot of havoc, and they ultimately are controlled by an elite group of millionaires. However, it is interesting to note that oftentimes whenever we're introduced to a human villain, it tends to be civilian based, and the military often play the hero part. Anyway, we also get an episode in season 10 that aired in the mid-2000s after the whole 9/11 paranoia that warned against the dangers of giving the military too much control in the name of security and taking too many freedoms away from their citizens. However, there's also Senator Kinsey, the sleazy politician who is most likely meant to be a Democrat, who does, he hates the role of the military and thinks it's exaggerated, and he constantly wants to slash their budget. So, it could go either way. It oftentimes skirts the political line, which is fine. I would never refer to the show as pro-American or pro-military propaganda, and make some political statements I agree with and others that I don't, but either way, I don't think it crosses the line at any time. But getting back to the Star Trek comparisons, what's interesting to note is that there's an episode from the 4th season called Beneath the Surface that is the exact same plot as the 2-part episode from Voyager called Workforce. In fact, the similarities are unbelievably similar. It just boggles my mind. It's like I'm watching the exact same episode, but a Voyager version and then an SG-1 version. As Beneath the Surface is about SG-1 traveling to a planet where their memories have been wiped so they can work in an underground facility. So they think that they're, different people, that they're from this planet and they're just plain workers, and they don't know who they really are until Teal'c starts to remember because of his alien nature. Whereas Workforce is about the crew of Voyager having their memories wiped and working for an alien power plant where they think that they're from that world and they're just plain workers and they don't remember who they are until Tuvok starts to remember their true nature because of his alien nature. Now, I saw Workforce first, so when I watched Beneath the Surface, I was like in awe because it was the exact same episode, beat for beat, which was ridiculous. So I didn't know which came first. So I did some research on the internet and I found out that Beneath the Surface aired roughly a year before. And I saw an article when Workforce aired, a lot of people complaining about Voyager ripping off Stargate SG-1. However, a further investigation showed that Workforce was originally shot a year before and originally intended to air in Voyager's 6th season, and that, in fact, Beneath the Surface and Workforce were written and produced roughly around the same time. So it's an interesting mystery of how these two episodes ended up exactly alike. I think it's likely the story idea was picked up by both studios or shows and that they both unknowingly or perhaps knowingly went for it at the same time, but I don't think either one ripped the other one off. I think they just sort of both knew what they were up to and both sort of grabbed onto this idea. That's my guess anyway. However, through the course of the series, I think we got a lot of very memorable standalone episodes that I put on par with many of the Star Trek episodes, as well as keeping things fresh and interesting with a very memorable cast of characters who were always entertaining to watch. And it was actually really impressive that they managed to keep this up for 10 years. So my rating for Stargate SG-1 overall is an 8, extremely good. A very memorable show that is definitely worth watching, although at times it borrows a bit heavily from Star Trek. It always has its own spin on things with characters you always enjoy to watch and have great relationships and interactions you want to see more of, like Jack O'Neill and Daniel Jackson, and it's amazing how it manages to stay interesting after 10 years, pretty much keeping the same quality throughout its entire run. Even though in its later seasons it did get a bit outrageous, it was always interesting. So that's it for my review of Stargate SG-1. If you haven't already, you should check out my top 10 episodes of Stargate SG-1. I'll put a link in the description below to that, as well as I'll be doing reviews and episode top 10s for Stargate Atlantis and Stargate Universe sometime in the future. I also do many more videos on many shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Orphan Black, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.